So let me go into some detail on that first one, independent review. There's a model that we can look back at that's accomplished similar reform to what I'm proposing needs to be accomplished here, and that's the BRAC Commission model. That's the Base Realignment and Closure Commission. Probably several of you know the history of this, but for those who don't, in the 70s and 80s, during the Cold War, there was incentive. There was a lot of reason to build up our military capacity and build new military bases throughout the country, throughout the world, really. But as the Cold War wound down, a lot of the value of those bases diminished. They had less and less military value. For those bases that were in members' districts, to propose closing them was a bit offensive, perhaps, to the members who had those bases in their districts. The Department of Defense did this. The Department of Defense wanted to get rid of bases that had little to no military value, but they found that every time they proposed one to get rid of, some champion would come through Congress and say, no, we can't get rid of that one because it's really important for these reasons. It would always short-circuit the process. So the solution was to have an independent commission look at all bases and put together a list of those bases that have little or no military value. There was a system for grading the bases, grade them on military value, and then there was an end result, which was this list that could be really long, could be really short. Congress didn't know going into it, but Congress was bound to follow the determination of this independent review panel. More importantly, or not more importantly, the independent review is probably the most important portion of that, but importantly, Congress could not, once they got that list from this independent panel, make changes to the list. They were either going to accept what was on that list as bases we're going to close, or stop the whole thing and not close any of them. There was no in between. Another model you can look at for independent review is the scientific peer review process that I'm part of on a regular basis. When a scientist or a researcher goes to publish his work in a scientific journal, in a scholarly journal, it's blind reviewed, meaning that if I send a paper off to be published, I take my name off of it, and I also don't know who's the reviewer, who the referee is. It's a blind process that makes it so that those who are perhaps my friends or who believe what I believe can't just make it pass, can't just say, oh yeah, Patrick wrote that, I'm going to make sure that gets published. Similarly, it removes the ability for people who have an agenda that was against mine, perhaps, to hurt my work. It's supposed to be blind. It's supposed to introduce independence into the process, and over time, I'd argue that it does work. Which takes me back to this. So you were all handed a piece of paper that said you would receive a door prize. Some of you, it said you would receive a prize if this was the letter B. And some of you, it said that you would receive a prize if this was the number 13. Now, this can obviously be interpreted either way. It's a bit of an ambiguous figure there. But you put some context around it, it becomes clear that that was actually the letter B. Or you put some context around it, it becomes clear that that was actually the number 13. The context is important here, and the lesson for the context part of this is agencies view problems within a certain context as well. Agencies are created with a mission, and whatever they see, be it a 13 or a B, they interpret within the lens of that mission they're created with. But then a second part, and the part that relates to independent review here is, what if it's ambiguous? What if it's a 13 and a B? Which, by the way, it's a 13 and a B, so no one actually won the prize because it's both at the same time. Well, if you have incentive to interpret things one way or the other, maybe you're going to act upon that incentive. If you get reward, if there were a substantial prize, if I had promised you, well, I guess there's restrictions on what I can give you because you're federal employees, but if there weren't restrictions and there were a substantial incentive for you to vote one way or the other, maybe you would have. And that same logic applies to agencies. When there's incentive for an agency to look at an ambiguous finding or an ambiguous result and interpret it one way or the other, you should expect them to act, to respond to incentives. After all, Agencies are composed of people, and people respond to incentives.